The Elwood First National Bank smelled of stale paper and fear. It was a scent Wyatt Callahan had come to know intimately over the last 4 years, the quiet dread of a man watching his world shrink 1 acre at a time. He stood in line, his son Tommy's small hand, sweating in his own, the 4-year-old's boots scuffing impatiently against the polished floorboards. Outside the Wyoming sun was a merciless hammer beating down on the dust-choked street until the air itself seemed to warp and shimmer. Almost done. Papa Tommy whispered, his voice a small chirp in the oppressive silence of the bank. Almost, son. Wyatt murmured, his gaze fixed on the teller, counting out the meager withdrawal. Just enough to pay the feed store, just enough to keep going for another month. That was when the front doors burst open, slamming against the interior walls with a crack like rifle fire. 3 men spilled into the room, faces obscured by dirty bandanas. The scent of gunpowder and hot dust followed them in acrid and sharp. Hooves thundered outside. Glass shattered as the butt of a shotgun smashed the teller's window. A woman screamed. Wyatt reacted without thinking. He swept Tommy behind him, pushing him low against the wall, his own body a shield. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice a low growl that carried no room for argument. He felt Tommy tremble, his small fingers clutching the back of Wyatt's worn denims. The lead robber, a tall, wiry man, with eyes like chips of cold slate, vaulted over the counter. "The safe now," he snarled at the terrified teller, a young man barely out of his teens. The other 2 men herded the customers into a corner, their pistols held steady. Wyatt's hand instinctively drifted toward his hip, where his Colt Peacemaker usually rested. But he'd left it on the wagon. A rancher didn't bring a gun to the bank unless he was robbing it. It was a mistake that sent a jolt of ice through his veins. He was helpless, a father protecting his son with nothing but his own body. The lead robber stuffed canvas bags with bills and coin, his movements practiced and efficient. As he turned to leave, his eyes caught a glint of silver on the floor near the teller's cage. It was a locket knocked from the teller's neck in the chaos. He snatched it up, his gloved fingers closing around it. Wyatt's breath hitched. His world narrowed to that single object. It was a simple silver oval etched with a pattern of climbing roses. He knew every curve, every imperfection. He had given it to Annalise on the night they promised themselves to each other under a canopy of stars, the same night they had created the small life now hiding behind his legs. The sight of it punched the air from his lungs. The bank, the robbers, the terrified whispers of the other townsfolk, it all dissolved into a haze. He was somewhere else 4 years ago, the memory hitting him with the force of a physical blow. The air was cool, smelling of pine and damp earth. Annalise's laughter was a silver bell in the darkness as he fastened the locket around her neck. "It's beautiful, Wyatt," she'd whispered, her fingers tracing the roses. "I'll never take it off." Her eyes the color of a summer sky just before a storm held a galaxy of promises. He had kissed her then, a kiss full of the certainty of a shared future, of a home and a family built on this unforgiving land. He could still feel the soft press of her lips, still smell the lavender in her hair. Then another memory, sharp and brutal, sliced through the first. Her father's carriage waiting at the edge of his property. The grim-faced men who had flanked her. The terror in her eyes as they led her away. "I'll come back for you, Wyatt," she had cried, her voice tearing. "For you and our son, I promise." She never did. A sharp shove brought him back to the present. One of the robbers was prodding him with the barrel of a rifle. "Get your head down, farmer." But Wyatt's eyes were locked on the locket now dangling from the lead robber's fingers. The man glanced at it, a flicker of something unreadable in his cold eyes, then stuffed it into his pocket as if it were just another piece of stolen property. a cold fury heavy and familiar as the weight of his gun belt settled in Wyatt's gut. That locket wasn't just silver. It was a promise. It was the last piece of a life that had been ripped away from him, a ghost he'd spent 4 years trying to bury under bitterness and hard labor. And this thief had taken it. The robbers backed out of the bank, their guns still trained on the frozen customers. They mounted their horses and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and shattered silence in their wake. Slowly, people began to move. The tellers slumped against the counter, sobbing. The sheriff would be called, questions would be asked, but Wyatt was deaf to it all. He knelt, turning to face his son. Tommy's Riverstone eyes were wide with fear. "Are they gone, Papa?" Wyatt pulled him into a fierce hug, burying his face in the boy's soft hair. "They're gone," he said, his voice rough. "We're safe." But as he held his son, the only good thing left in his world, his gaze drifted to the empty street. He wasn't just a victim of a robbery. He was a man who had just watched the last tangible piece of his past get stolen. The anger in his chest was no longer a dull ache. It was a fresh, raw wound. The locket was out there, and with it, the ghost of Annalise, a ghost he now realized had never truly left him at all. The Callahan Ranch was a study in stubborn resilience. Its fences were warped by years of wind and sun, the barn leaned with the weariness of age, and the house itself, a simple 2-room structure, bore the scars of a fire that had nearly claimed it 4 years prior. This was Wyatt's kingdom, a patch of hard-won dirt at the edge of the hills, a place where he and Tommy carved out a life from dust and silence. Days after the bank robbery, a heavy quiet returned to the ranch, but the peace was a fragile thing. Wyatt worked with a grim intensity, splitting firewood with sharp, angry strokes, as if he wanted the logs to bleed. He mended fences with his knuckles, white his jaw, a tight line of unresolved fury. The image of the locket being pocketed by a stranger was burned into his mind. One morning, he found Tommy by the well, staring down into its dark, cool depths. "Papa," the boy said, his small face serious. "The water tastes funny." Wyatt drew a bucket, the rope groaning in protest. The water was cloudy with an oily sheen on its surface. It carried a faint, bitter scent. He swore under his breath, dumping the bucket far from the vegetable garden Annalise had once tended. Someone had tainted their well. It wasn't an accident, it was a message. That night, as he tucked Tommy into his small bed, the boy clutched a faded blue scarf worn soft with years of affection. "Tell me about Mama again," he whispered, his voice thick with sleep. It was their ritual, a story polished smooth by countless retellings. Wyatt sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress springs sighing under his weight. She was like the wildflowers that grow up on the ridge. He began, his voice softer than it had been all day. Strong and beautiful and a little bit wild. Her hair was the color of wheat just before the harvest, and her eyes were the color of a clear sky. And she drew pictures, Tommy added, his own eyes drooping. Wyatt managed a faint smile. "She did. She drew you before you were even born. She drew this whole ranch the way it was going to be." He paused, the familiar bitterness, a cold stone in his gut. And then she had to go away. Why, the question was always the same, innocent and sharp as a shard of glass. Wyatt's jaw tightened. He had no answer that a 4-year-old could understand. No answer that didn't taste of betrayal. Her family needed her back east, he said, the lie thin and worn. It was a long way away. Tommy was quiet for a moment. "Will she come back?" Wyatt looked away toward the small, hand-drawn portrait of Annalise that sat on his dresser, a drawing he himself had made from memory, the only image of her Tommy had ever known. "I don't know, son," he whispered. "Go to sleep now." He watched until the boy's breathing evened out, then retreated to the porch. He sat on the top step, the tainted well water, a symbol of the poison that had seeped into his life. The attacks were subtle, a cut fence line, a spooked herd, and now this. Someone was testing him, pushing him. For months, whispers in town had followed him like shadows, murmurs of the Callahan curse of his father's sharp land dealings years ago. Wyatt had always dismissed them as jealous gossip. Now he wasn't so sure. The world felt like it was closing in, and he was alone, fighting a war against ghosts he couldn't see. The ghost of his father's reputation, the ghost of the man who stole the locket, and the most persistent ghost of all Annalise. He looked up at the vast, star-dusted sky, the same sky under which she had made her promise. The loneliness was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest until it was hard to breathe. He was losing. He could feel it in the dry soil, in the tainted water, in the aching emptiness of his home. A week later, the stagecoach from Cheyenne rattled into Elwood, churning up a plume of ochre dust. Among the handful of weary travelers who disembarked was a woman who moved with a quiet, desperate purpose. She gave her name at the hotel as Mrs. Smith, a widow from back east, looking for a new start. Her dress was simple, her face pale and drawn, but her eyes the color of a summer sky just before a storm scanned every face, every street corner searching. This was Annalise. For 4 years she had been a prisoner, first in her father's house, then in a forced, loveless marriage to a cruel associate of his. Her husband's recent sudden death in a gambling dispute had been her first taste of freedom. She had used what little money she had to travel west, chasing a ghost of a rumor she'd heard from a disgraced former servant of her father's, that Wyatt and Tommy had not died in the fire, after all, but had simply moved on. She spent 2 days wandering the town, her hope dwindling with every sunset. She asked cautious questions, showing no one the small, tattered drawing of a 4-year-old Wyatt she kept hidden in her reticule. No one recognized the name Callahan. On the 3rd day, her hope nearly extinguished, she saw him. A little boy with sun-warmed hair was chasing a dog near the general store. He had Wyatt's determined chin and a familiar, joyful laugh that struck her like a physical blow. Her heart stopped. It couldn't be. He stopped, turning to his father, who was loading sacks of flour onto a wagon. It was Wyatt. Older, harder the lines around his eyes, carved deeper by sun and sorrow. But it was him. He was alive. And the boy was Tommy. Annalise felt the world tilt. Tears blurred her vision as she clutched a hitching post for support. She wanted to run to them, to scream their names, but fear held her rooted to the spot. What would he think, that she was a ghost, come back to haunt him? After 4 years of silence, what could she possibly say? She followed them at a distance, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She watched them ride out of town, their path leading toward the low-lying hills to the west. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she rented the last tired horse from the livery stable and followed. The Callahan ranch stood alone, silhouetted against a sky bruised with storm clouds. Annalise slid from the horse at the gate, her legs trembling. Her heart pounded so loudly she swore the cattle could hear it. Across the yard, Wyatt was splitting firewood, the rhythmic thud of the axe, a harsh, angry heartbeat. He looked up, sensing her presence. The axe froze mid-swing. His body went rigid. The wind itself seemed to pause, holding its breath. The world narrowed to the space between them, a chasm of 4 lost years. Wyatt, she breathed the word, a fragile prayer. He dropped the axe. It thudded into the earth. He took a single step back, a motion of pure, undiluted shock. His face tanned and weathered, drained of all color. "Tommy," he shouted, his voice sharp as broken glass. The boy peeked out from behind a fence post, clutching the hem of his shirt. "Inside now. Close the gate." Tommy hesitated, his curious gaze fixed on the strange woman. "I said now," Wyatt roared. The boy retreated, the gate creaking shut between mother and son. The sound of the latch clicking into place was the sound of a final judgment. Annalise's legs gave out. She collapsed to her knees in the dust, clutching the wooden bars of the gate, as if they were the only thing tethering her to this world. A sob tore from her throat, raw and ragged. Rain began to fall, first in soft sprinkles, then in a cold driving sheet, soaking her thin dress, pasting her hair to her skin. "I looked for you," she cried, her voice lost in the rising storm. "They told me you were dead. I looked for both of you." Wyatt stood like a statue carved from granite, the rain plastering his shirt to his broad shoulders. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, his lips pressed into a bloodless line. He turned his back on her and stalked toward the house, his boots sinking into the softening mud. He made it to the porch before he stopped, his shoulders rising and falling with ragged breaths. Inside, Tommy's small face appeared in the window, his palms pressed to the glass, watching the weeping woman crumpled outside the gate. Wyatt stepped into the house, closing the door behind him with a dull thud. But he didn't move away. He stood in the shadows of the front room, watching her through the window. The storm raged, mirroring the tempest in his own chest. A flash of lightning illuminated her, a pathetic, broken figure. A clap of thunder followed, and she flinched violently, hunching over and pressing her hands to her ears. His own hand went to the doorknob. He gripped it, his knuckles white as instinct to run to her, to shield her from the storm, warring with the cold, hard bitterness that had been his only companion for 4 years. She never wrote. She never came back. Now she shows up like this, with a story. Why now? Why now? He let go of the knob, stepping back from the door. He leaned his head against the cool wood of the wall, his eyes squeezed shut. The rage was a physical thing, a sickness in his gut. But beneath it, seeing her so broken and alone, a question he had refused to ask for years clawed its way to the surface. He whispered it to the empty room, his voice hoarse with pain. "Why did you leave us, Annalise?" Annalise awoke to the scent of wood smoke and something warm. A rough wool blanket was tucked carefully around her shoulders. She was lying on a narrow cot in a small, sparse room. The wooden beams overhead, the scarred dresser in the corner, a wave of dizziness washed over her. She knew this room. Years ago, she had folded baby clothes here, had watched Wyatt sleep in the old rocking chair with a newborn Tommy cradled in his arms. Now it smelled of dust and disuse. Beside the cot, on a small crate, sat a bowl of porridge still steaming slightly. A spoon rested beside it. Her fingers, trembling, reached for it. She hadn't been offered food with simple kindness in years. The door creaked open. Wyatt entered, his face a mask of stone. He carried a damp cloth and did not look at her, moving instead to the dresser, where he began wiping away a layer of dust. "You should eat," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. She tried to sit up, her body weak and aching. "Wyatt, I only brought you in because I don't want my son watching a woman die in his front yard." He cut her off, his words hitting like a slap. She flinched, as if struck. He finally turned to look at her, and for a fleeting second the shield of his anger slipped, revealing the raw wound beneath. "You left?" he said, his voice low and guttural. "You left him. You left me. Without a single damn word." "I didn't choose to leave," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "Spare me the stories, Annalise," he snapped, turning his back again. "You made your choice. Rich family over a dirt-poor rancher. It's an old tale." "It's not a tale." Her voice rose, laced with desperation. "My father, He locked me away. He had men they held me until I agreed to marry someone else. A business partner. He showed me a forged death certificate, yours and Tommy's. He said the fire had taken you both. Wyatt laughed, a dry, bitter sound that held no humor. A fire I barely survived trying to save the home we were supposed to build. And a death certificate. How convenient. He turned back, his eyes blazing. And what about the wedding announcement I got in the mail? Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore cordially invite you to celebrate the marriage of their daughter, Annalise, to Mr. Silas Kane. No letter of explanation. Just an invitation to my own personal hell. I suppose your father forced you to write that too. The name hit Annalise like a physical blow. Silas Kane. The cruel, calculating man she'd been forced to call husband. The man whose name she had never spoken to Wyatt. They made me sign it, she whispered, her shoulders shaking. He stood over me while I did it. And you stayed gone. Wyatt pressed, his voice relentless. For 4 years, even after this Silas Kane. What happened to him? He's dead, she said, her voice barely audible. Convenient again, Wyatt spat. So you came running back here, to your backup plan. The accusation stole her breath. She clutched the rough blanket to her chest, the porridge forgotten. She wanted to scream the rest of the truth about her imprisonment, the beatings, the constant surveillance, but she could see it was useless. The wall he had built around his heart was too high, too thick. All he could see was his own pain. He saw the defeat in her eyes, and his expression hardened further. He picked up something from the dresser and stepped toward her. It was Tommy's small, faded blue scarf. He sleeps with this, Wyatt said, his voice roughening with an emotion he couldn't conceal. Every night. Calls it his mama blanket. Do you have any idea how many times he's asked me why he doesn't have a mother like the other boys? What was I supposed to tell him, Annalise? That she loved us, but not enough to fight for us. She bowed her head, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. I'm sorry, Wyatt, she whispered. I am so, so sorry. He stared at her for a long moment, the scarf clutched in his hand, like a relic from a life he'd failed to protect. Then, without another word, he turned and left the room, closing the door softly behind him. The sound was more final than a slam. Annalise was left alone with the cold porridge and the suffocating weight of his disbelief. The next afternoon, Wyatt was replacing a rotted board on the porch when a buggy pulled up to the gate. A man in a tailored suit and polished city boots stepped out, moving with an easy confidence that seemed out of place in the rugged landscape. He was handsome, with a charismatic smile and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Mr. Callahan, he called out, his voice smooth and cultured. Pardon the intrusion. My name is Silas Kane. I'm a land speculator out of Cheyenne. Wyatt froze the hammer in his hand, feeling suddenly heavy. He straightened up slowly, his eyes narrowing. Silas Kane. The name from the wedding announcement. He felt a cold dread mix with the simmering rage in his gut. Kane opened the gate and strode toward the house, his smile never wavering. I've been making inquiries in town. They say you hold one of the last independent parcels in this valley. I'm here to make you an offer. A very generous one. He named a figure that made Wyatt's head spin. It was enough to start over anywhere, to give Tommy a life free from dust and debt. My land's not for sale, Wyatt said, his voice flat. Kane's smile didn't falter, but his eyes grew colder. Everything is for sale, Mr. Callahan, for the right price. A man must consider his son's future. This is hard country. A man alone can lose everything overnight. There was a subtle emphasis on the word lose that sounded less like advice and more like a threat. From inside the house, Annalise heard the voices. She peered through the dusty window pane, and her blood ran cold. was him, Silas Kane. Not dead as she had been told, but here, on Wyatt's porch. The lie she had been fed about his death was just another cage. He had followed her. Before she could react, another figure appeared walking up the path from town. It was an old man with bent shoulders and a worn postal satchel slung across his chest. His face was a roadmap of guilt. "Wyatt Callahan," the old man said, his voice trembling as he stopped at the foot of the porch steps, ignoring Silas Kane completely. "Who's asking?" Wyatt replied, his attention torn between the two unwelcome visitors. "Name's Samuel Layton," the old man said, wringing his battered hat in his hands. I used to work the postal line. I have something that belongs to you." He reached into his satchel and pulled out a thick, yellowed envelope. It was stained and curled at the edges. A dark brown spot marred one corner. Old blood. It was supposed to be delivered 4 years ago. Silas Kane's charming demeanor vanished. A flicker of genuine alarm crossed his face. "Perhaps I should return at a more convenient time," he said stiffly, already backing away. But Wyatt's attention was locked on the letter. He took it from Samuel's shaking hand, his fingers numb. He broke the brittle wax seal and unfolded the pages. Annalise's elegant script, usually so fluid, was jagged and frantic. "My dearest Wyatt, they are forcing me. My father has promised me to a man named Silas Kane, a monster in a rich man's suit. I am a prisoner in my own home. They took our son from me, telling me he was ill. But I know it is a lie to control me. Please, Wyatt, tell Tommy I never wanted to leave. I tried to escape, and they beat me for it. They locked me in the cellar. This letter is my only hope. If you get this, come for me. I will keep fighting, but I don't know how long I can hold on. I love you. I love our son more than my own life. Forgive me for my weakness. Yours forever, Annalise." The paper fluttered from Wyatt's fingers. The world seemed to drop out from under him. He gripped the porch railing to keep from falling, his knuckles turning white. The words echoed in his head. A monster in a rich man's suit. Silas Kane. He turned his head, his gaze locking onto the man now hastily retreating toward the gate. "I was paid to keep it." Samuel whispered, tears tracking through the dust on his cheeks. "Her father, he said you were a bad influence. I told myself it wasn't my place. But seeing her in town, looking like a ghost, I couldn't live with it no more." She fought. The words were a revelation, a key that unlocked 4 years of bitterness. She had fought for them. And Silas Kane. He wasn't just the man she'd been forced to marry. He was her jailer. And he was here. Wyatt vaulted over the porch railing, his body moving on pure, unadulterated rage. "Kane," he bellowed. Silas spun around his face, a mask of fury. The charming facade was gone, replaced by the cold cruelty Annalise knew so well. "You should have taken the money, Callahan," he hissed. Annalise burst through the front door. "Wyatt, no." But it was too late. Wyatt's fist connected with Kane's jaw with a sickening crack. The fight was brutal and short. Wyatt, fueled by 4 years of pain and righteous fury, was a force of nature. He drove Silas back against the buggy, landing blow after blow. From his coat, Silas pulled a small Derringer pistol. He aimed it at Wyatt's chest, but before he could fire, Annalise grabbed a heavy piece of firewood from the pile on the porch and brought it down hard on his wrist. The gun clattered to the ground. Silas cried out in pain and scrambled into his buggy, whipping his horse into a frantic gallop. He fled down the road, leaving a swirl of dust and unanswered questions in his wake. Wyatt stood panting, his chest heaving. He turned to Annalise, his eyes full of 1,000 emotions: regret, shame, and a dawning, fragile hope. He looked from her pale, determined face to the letter lying in the dust. He finally understood. He took a step toward her, then another. He didn't speak. He simply reached out and gently touched the bruise on her cheek, a faint, yellowing mark he hadn't let himself truly see before. His thumb brushed over it with a tenderness that spoke more than words ever could. "He did this to you?" he asked, his voice thick. Annalise nodded, tears welling in her eyes. All the anger drained out of him, replaced by a profound, soul-deep ache. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against him, his face buried in her hair. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words torn from him. "Annalise, forgive me. I'm so sorry." She wrapped her arms around his waist, clinging to him, as the sobs she had held back for 4 long years finally broke free. They stood there for a long time, 2 broken people finally beginning to heal, while the old postman watched from a distance, his own burden finally lifted. The truth was out, but as the dust from Silas Kane's buggy settled in the distance, they both knew the danger was far from over. The days that followed were a fragile truce with the past. Annalise and Wyatt moved around each other with a careful tenderness, the space between them filled with unspoken words. The truth of her captivity and his misguided bitterness lay open, a wound they were both learning how to tend. At a town social held in the church hall, a meager attempt to lift spirits after the bank robbery, they presented a united front for the first time. Annalise, holding Tommy's hand, felt the weight of the townsfolk's stares. Whispers followed her, like autumn leaves skittering across a dry road. But Wyatt stood beside her, his presence a silent, unwavering statement. When one of the town's more pious women made a cutting remark about Annalise's sudden reappearance, Wyatt simply placed a hand on the small of her back and guided her away, his eyes daring anyone else to speak. It was during the fiddle music, as couples began to dance, that Annalise felt a chill snake down her spine. Across the crowded room, she saw him, Silas Kane. He was not dressed as a ruffian, but as a gentleman deep in conversation with the mayor and the town banker. He laughed at something one of them said, a charming, disarming sound that made Annalise's stomach clench. He looked up, and his eyes met hers across the room. The charming smile he gave her was terrifying. It was the same smile he'd worn after her father had left the room. The smile of a predator that knows its prey is trapped. She saw it all in that one look. He wasn't just a jilted husband. This was about more than her. It was about Wyatt. It was about the land. She grabbed Wyatt's arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. "What is he doing here?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Wyatt followed her gaze. His body went rigid. "He's poisoning the well," he said, his voice a low growl. "Not just mine, the whole town's." The realization dawned on them both. Silas wasn't a mere brute seeking revenge. He was intelligent, manipulative. He was weaving himself into the fabric of Elwood, presenting himself as a savior, a wealthy investor, while secretly strangling the town's resources. He was turning Wyatt's neighbors against him, making Wyatt's ranch seem like the source of the bad luck the Callahan curse made real. Their quiet reconciliation was over. The fight was no longer just for their family. It was for their home and their community. Silas, sensing he had been discovered, dropped all pretense. The attacks on the Callahan ranch escalated from clandestine sabotage to open warfare. One night a fire broke out in the barn. Wyatt and Annalise worked side by side, beating back the flames with wet blankets, their faces smudged with soot, their lungs burning. They saved the structure, but half their winter hay was gone. A few days later, a section of their north fence was cut, and their small herd of cattle was stampeded, scattered for miles across the unforgiving terrain. Wyatt was run ragged, trying to hold everything together. One evening, Silas Kane rode up to the ranch, not in a buggy, but on a powerful black stallion flanked by two hard-faced men. Wyatt recognized one as the robber who had stolen the locket from the bank. Still not willing to sell Callahan, Silas called out, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Get off my land, Kane," Wyatt warned, stepping onto the porch, his hand resting on the Colt at his hip. Silas laughed. "Your land, this land, was built on a crime, a sin, and the sins of the father are to be visited upon the son." "What are you talking about?" Wyatt demanded. "My father's name was Daniel Kane." Silas said, his voice turning hard and cold. "Perhaps you remember your own father speaking of him. He was a partner in a silver claim right here in these hills. Your father, a man with a talent for paperwork and a thirst for wealth, handled the contracts. He cheated my father, Mr. Callahan. A few clever clauses, a forged signature, and suddenly my family's share was worthless. We lost everything. My father died a broken man, digging for scraps in another man's mine, while yours built this ranch on our ruin." The blood drained from Wyatt's face. He remembered the stories, the hushed arguments between his parents, his father's dark moods. It all clicked into place. "This isn't about Annalise," Silas continued, his eyes glittering with a chilling righteousness. "She was just a means to an end, a way to get close to you. This is about justice. I'm not just going to take this land. I'm going to take everything you love. Your home, your name, your son. I am going to leave you with nothing but dust and regret, just as your father left mine." He spurred his horse, turning to leave. "Every hardship you face from now on, Callahan, know that it comes from me. It is the price of your family's debt." He rode off, leaving Wyatt standing on the porch, paralyzed by the revelation. This wasn't a land dispute. It was a vendetta, a blood feud passed down from one generation to the next. And Silas Kane would not stop until Wyatt's entire world was reduced to ash. The storm that had been threatening for days finally broke, a furious onslaught of wind and rain that turned the world to a churning chaos of mud and sound. It was the perfect cover for an act of pure evil. While Wyatt was out desperately trying to round up the last of his scattered cattle before they were swept away in a flash flood, Silas Kane and his men descended on the ranch house. Annalise was inside with Tommy reading to him by the flickering lamplight as thunder rattled the window panes. A sudden violent crash from the front door sent her heart leaping into her throat. Before she could react, Silas was there, his face slick with rain, his eyes burning with a terrifying zeal. "It's time to pay the final installment, Annalise," he said, grabbing Tommy. The boy screamed. Annalise fought like a cornered wildcat. But Silas's men restrained her, her nails scratching uselessly against their thick coats. "Wyatt," she screamed, her voice swallowed by the storm. "He can't hear you." Silas sneered, pulling a struggling Tommy into his arms. "He'll find the boy when I'm ready for him. At the old Black Creek mine. Tell him to come alone. It's time the sons settled their father's accounts." They were gone as quickly as they came, leaving Annalise on the floor, the door banging in the wind, the sound of her son's terrified cries echoing in her ears. When Wyatt returned soaked and exhausted, he found her cradling Tommy's faded blue scarf, her body shaking with sobs. The story came out in a torrent of frantic, broken words. The rage that filled Wyatt was cold and absolute. It burned away all fear, all doubt. There was no choice, no negotiation, only an ending. He checked his Colt, loading every chamber. He grabbed a rifle from the rack above the fireplace. "I'm coming with you," Annalise said, her voice steel. She stood up, her face pale but resolute. In her hand, she held Wyatt's spare pistol. He is my son too. I failed to protect him once. I will not fail again. Wyatt looked at her, at the fire in her eyes that matched his own. He saw not the frightened woman who had collapsed at his gate, but a warrior. He nodded once, a grim acknowledgement of their shared purpose. Together, they rode into the heart of the storm, toward the abandoned silver mine where their world would either be reclaimed or destroyed forever. The Black Creek mine was a gaping maw in the side of the mountain, a place of ghosts and forgotten dreams. Timbers sagged slick with rain, and the wind howled through the entrance like a dying breath. Inside, lanterns cast long dancing shadows that twisted men into monsters. Silas Kane stood near a deep, dark shaft, one hand gripping Tommy's shoulder. The boy was crying silently, his small face streaked with tears and dirt. Wyatt and Annalise dismounted at the entrance, moving through the torrential rain like specters. "Let him go, Kane," Wyatt shouted over the roar of the storm. Silas smiled, a chilling sight in the flickering light. "Welcome, Callahan. I'm so glad you could both make it. It's fitting, isn't it? This is where my father lost his future. It's only right that you lose yours in the same place. This is between you and me," Wyatt said, taking a step forward. "Oh, it's far too late for that," Silas replied, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "This has always been about family. Which reminds me." He gestured to the shadows. A figure stepped forward, and Annalise gasped. It was her father. His face was gray, his eyes hollowed out by greed and cowardice. "Father," she whispered, her voice full of disbelief. "He was my partner all along," Silas announced with theatrical flair. A most enthusiastic one. He saw a chance to rid himself of a troublesome daughter and a penniless son-in-law, all while securing a share of this valley. "He's the one who told me you were alive, Wyatt. He helped me orchestrate everything." The betrayal was absolute, a blow more stunning than any fist. Annalise stared at her father, who refused to meet her gaze. He had not just abandoned her. He had sold her. He had sold them all. "Now," Silas said, pulling Tommy closer to the edge of the mine shaft, "you will sign over the deed to your land, Callahan. And then perhaps I'll let the boy live." Wyatt's rifle was up in an instant. "You'll get nothing." The cavern erupted in a cacophony of gunfire. Silas's men opened fire from the shadows. Wyatt and Annalise dove for cover behind a stack of old ore carts, returning fire. The air grew thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder, the blasts echoing like thunder. Wyatt moved with deadly precision, a man with nothing left to lose. He took down one of Kane's men, then another. Annalise, her hands surprisingly steady, fired at the lantern nearest her father, plunging his side of the cavern into darkness and confusion. In that moment of chaos, Wyatt charged forward straight for Silas. The two men collided, their fight a desperate, brutal struggle at the very edge of the abyss. Silas was strong, but Wyatt was fueled by a primal need to protect his son. He drove Silas back blow by staggering blow. With a final desperate heave, Wyatt slammed Silas against a rotting support beam. Silas's gun skittered away, falling perilously close to the shaft. He was disarmed, helpless. Wyatt raised his fist for the final blow, the one that would send Silas plunging into the darkness forever. Revenge was a hot, sweet taste in his mouth. "Wyatt, don't," Annalise's voice cut through his rage. She stood a few feet away, her own gun trained on her cowering father. "Don't become him. We need justice, not vengeance. For Tommy, let him see his father be the better man." Wyatt froze his knuckles inches from Silas's face. He looked at Kane's terrified eyes, then at his son who was watching him. His small face a mixture of fear and hope. Annalise was right. Killing Silas would make him a monster in his son's eyes. It would perpetuate the cycle of hatred that had started with their fathers. His fist slowly uncurled. With a guttural roar of frustration and release, he hauled Silas away from the edge and threw him to the ground. "It's over," Wyatt growled. The storm outside began to subside as the sheriff and his deputies, alerted by the sounds of the gunfight, swarmed the mine. Silas Kane and his last remaining man were taken into custody. Annalise watched as her father was led away in irons, a broken, pathetic man who didn't dare look his daughter in the eye. Wyatt rushed to Tommy, sweeping him up into his arms and holding him tight. Annalise joined them, her arms wrapping around them both, her tears mixing with the rain on their faces. They were bruised, battered, and betrayed, but they were together. They were a family. And as they stepped out of the darkness of the mine into the clean, rain-washed air, they knew the feud was finally truly over. In the quiet days that followed, the Callahan Ranch began to heal. The rhythm of life returned slower and more deliberate than before. Wyatt repaired the barn, his movements sure and steady. Annalise replanted the garden, coaxing new life from the damp earth. Tommy's laughter, once a rare and precious sound, now filled the small house, chasing away the last of the shadows. Silas Kane and Annalise's father were tried and sentenced to long years in the territorial prison. The town of Elwood, having seen Silas's true colors, rallied around the Callahans. Neighbors brought pies and offered help mending the fences, their gestures a quiet apology for their earlier suspicions. One afternoon, Annalise sat on the porch steps, a pen and paper in her lap. She was writing a letter not to the man in prison, but to the memory of the father she once thought she had. It was not a letter of hate or anger, but of finality. She wrote of forgiveness, not for his sake, but for her own, freeing herself from the chains of his betrayal. When she was finished, she did not send it. She folded it carefully and burned it in the hearth, watching the smoke rise up the chimney and disappear into the clear blue sky. She was free. Wyatt found quiet moments to simply be with her. He would come up behind her while she was hanging laundry, his hand resting on her waist for just a moment, a silent reassurance that he was there. They didn't need to speak of the horrors they had endured. Their shared survival was a language all its own. A few weeks later, as the sun began to dip below the hills, painting the sky in strokes of orange and violet, Wyatt took her and Tommy by the hand. He led them up the grassy ridge that overlooked their ranch, the same ridge where wildflowers grew in stubborn, beautiful profusion. They stood together, watching the lights soften over their land. The fields were green, the fences stood straight and true, and smoke curled lazily from their chimney. It was a picture of peace, a peace they had fought for and bled for. Wyatt turned to Annalise. Her hair was catching the golden light, and her eyes held a calm serenity he had never seen before. He knelt on one knee, taking her hand in his. He didn't have a fancy ring, only a simple silver band he had kept safe for years. It had been his mother's. "Annalise," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "We've seen the worst of what people can do to each other. We've been torn apart by lies and greed and the ghosts of our fathers. But we found our way back." He looked over at Tommy, who was watching them with a wide, knowing smile. "We are already a family." Wyatt continued, his gaze returning to hers. "In every way that matters. I'm not asking you to marry me to fix what was broken. I'm asking you to marry me so we can build something new, something that belongs only to us, a future free from the past." Tears welled in Annalise's eyes, but they were tears of joy. She looked at this strong, good man kneeling before her at the beautiful boy who was their son, and at the home spread out below them. This was where she belonged. This was her home. He slipped his mother's ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. "Yes," she whispered, her voice full of all the love and certainty in the world. "Yes, Wyatt. 1,000 times yes." He stood and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a tenderness that held the promise of 1,000 peaceful sunsets to come. Tommy ran to them, wrapping his small arms around their legs, his happy shout echoing across the quiet valley. The three of them stood there on the hill, a complete and unbreakable family, bathed in the warm, forgiving light of the setting sun, finally at peace.